We all know that Nintendo has created many well-known and successful game franchises. They have been innovative to the video game industry in many ways in terms of gameplay and story. Many of them have remained to be our favorites to this day. But there is one series that has remained elusive and underrated by most Western audiences. And the series I'm referring to is the Mother franchise, or EarthBound as it's known here in the US. The games are known for their deep storylines, quirky humor, and gameplay that is untraditional for most RPGs. Unlike most RPGs at the time that were set in a fantasy setting, these games took place in a more Americanized setting, or at least Americanized in Japan's perspective. The games were created by Shigesato Itoi. In the US, he is best known for creating EarthBound, but in Japan, he is considered to be an influential icon. By profession, he is an essayist and copywriter, and has his own website entitled Hobo Nikkan Itoi Shinban, or in English, Almost Daily Itoi News. As a writer, he used his skills well for the Mother games. He wrote the stories as well as the in-game dialogue. The first game, entitled Mother, debuted in Japan in 1989. The game stars a kid with psychic powers named Ninten who has to save his homeland from an invading alien army. Along the way, he meets several other characters with different abilities who join him. During his journey, he gains more psychic abilities and solves the mystery of the invading army and their connection to his great-grandparents. The game used odd humor in its dialogue and other situations. This game is considered by the fans to be the hardest one in the series. This is due to its level grinding, random encounters, and large maps, which are typical for most RPGs. Even so, it is still an important entry since it's the one that pioneered the franchise. At Nintendo of America, the game was fully translated into English and set to release on the Nintendo Entertainment System in the early 90s. However, the game was delayed due to the release of the Super Nintendo in 1991. They didn't want to release the game if the popularity of the Super Nintendo would overshadow it. The game was again planned to release in 1994, but due to the NES's dying popularity, it was eventually cancelled altogether. In 1998, the translated ROM of the game was found by a fan translation group called Demiforce. They extracted the data and released it via the internet. Originally, this game was going to be called EarthBound, but because Mother 2 was released on the Super Nintendo as EarthBound, they had to retitle the NES game EarthBound Zero to avoid confusion. In 1994, Mother 2 was released in Japan and then overseas a year later as EarthBound for the Super Nintendo. The main character of this game is another kid with psychic powers named Ness. At the beginning of the game, a meteor crashes nearby Ness's house. When he goes up to investigate, he finds an alien from the future who tells him that he plus 3 other children are destined to save the world from another invasion by an evil entity named Gigas. So, he ventures out to find the 3 other children and to unite his powers with the Earth to enable himself to face the corrupting force. Like the previous game, it uses eccentric humor in both the in-game events and the character dialogue. This game was easier than the previous game though. Level grinding wasn't as tedious, and instead of random encounters, the player could actually see the enemies before fighting them. This made it easier to avoid battling if they didn't want to. Unfortunately, at the time of this game's release, people were indifferent towards it. There are several reasons why the game didn't do so well as Nintendo thought. At the time, the Americans' reception of RPGs were still lukewarm. This is kind of ironic seeing as how other more well-known RPGs on the Super Nintendo were released at the time. Final Fantasy IV and VI, or 2 and 3 as they were called here in the US, were released on the Super Nintendo before EarthBound, and they both had their critical successes. The same goes for Chrono Trigger, which was released later the same year as EarthBound. Not to mention Super Mario RPG was released a year later, which was also critically acclaimed. Another reason why it didn't do so well is because of its marketing. When advertised in Nintendo Power, they gave it taglines like, "This game stinks." They tried to advertise the game to kids by using gross-out humor without giving much detail about the game itself. But regardless of these reasons, the game has developed a cult following which still remains to this day. After the release of EarthBound, the development for Mother 3 began. It was originally planned to be made as a Super Famicom game, but was later moved to the Nintendo 64 disk drive. a disc-based add-on planned for the Nintendo 64. When released in Japan, the disc drive became a commercial failure and was never released overseas. As a result, the project for Mother 3 was then moved to the Nintendo 64 itself, as well as other games originally planned for the disc drive. A trailer for the game as well as a playable demo was released at Nintendo Space World event in 1999. It was also planned to be titled EarthBound 64 in America. Unfortunately, the development team had trouble working with the 3D engine for the game. So, in late 2000, Nintendo announced the project's cancellation. However, Shigesato Itoi didn't completely abandon the project. Even though the N64 version was cancelled, the game itself wasn't. In 1999, a fan site called Starman.net was established. The website is still active to this day and is dedicated to promote anything related to the Mother franchise. During their first year, they developed a petition to bring the first Mother game to the Game Boy Color. They received about 1,850 signatures, which they sent to Nintendo and never heard back from. 1 year later, after talk of EarthBound 64's cancellation, they made another petition to bring the game back to development. This time, they received over 10,000 signatures. After sending those signatures to Nintendo, they still didn't hear back. In early 2003, they made one last petition to request that Mother 3 would be released in some form. After much effort, more than 30,000 signatures were gathered and sent to Nintendo. In the same year, commercials for Mother 1+2 for the Game Boy Advance began to air in Japan. At the end of one commercial was a brief announcement that Mother 3 was again in development. In 2006, Mother 3 was finally released for the Game Boy Advance. This game starts out in an old Western-style setting in a utopian society with no monetary system. The game opens with two brothers named Lucas and Klaus and their mother returning home from visiting their grandfather. When making their way home, an army of uniformed men called Pigmasts invade their forest nearby their village. The first half of the game then shifts from the perspective of different characters as they face the Pygmast army who invade their land and turn it into a consumer society. Even though this game keeps the goofy and peculiar mood that the franchise is known for, this game had darker and sadder themes than the previous two games. It involves learning how to cope with the loss of loved ones and the dangers of consumerism. Sadly, this game has stayed exclusive to Japan. One of the main reasons for this was because of the poor sales that EarthBound had. Nintendo of America was afraid that Mother 3 would suffer the same fate, so they didn't want to take any chances. However, the number of fans have steadily increased over time, so shouldn't that not be a problem anymore? Well, here's what the president of Nintendo of America, Reggie Fils-Aimé, said back in 2007.
From Nintendo's perspective, we have always looked at titles case by case and launched them in the appropriate markets. You know, for example, I'm still being bombarded by Mother fans who are asking for that title to be translated into English and launched here in the U.S. So there's always been a difference. What we're looking to make sure is that we have titles launching at the right time to maintain business momentum, either for the Wii or for the DS, and that's just a smart business approach.
Well then, what are you waiting for, Reggie? It's been 6 years. Shouldn't you have delivered to those customers who have bombarded you by now? Anyways, because Nintendo didn't release Mother 3 overseas, Starman.net decided to do it themselves by creating an English translated patch which they posted on their branch-off site called Fabi.net. They also made the patch available in several other languages as well. It's actually very well done, with just a few minor glitches here and there. Keep in mind though, this is just a patch and not the actual game itself. The people who worked on the patch stated that if Nintendo ever does decide to release an official translation, then they will remove the patch from their site immediately. They also put a disclaimer on the patch that tells the player to buy the said translation as well. Again, if Nintendo will ever make it. As for the other two games, the first one has yet to see an official re-release overseas. The English translation of EarthBound Zero was only released on a few prototype cartridges that are incredibly rare. On the other hand, some sites sell reproduction cartridges of the game which are easier to find and not too expensive. EarthBound, on the other hand, has just recently been announced to be released on the Wii U's Virtual Console. Nintendo's president Satoru Iwata confirmed that the game will come out by the end of this year. One possible reason why it took so long to be re-released was because of copyright issues. The game contains many pop culture references, and some of the music sounds familiar to songs from other artists. However, the pop culture references shouldn't really be a problem. Now that the re-release has been confirmed, this is no longer the case. Even so, all three Mother games were huge successes in Japan. Because of this, fans have wondered if there would be a fourth game in the franchise. But after the release of Mother 3, Shigesato Itoi said that it was the last one that he'll ever work on.
4ないですよ。4はもうない。ないです。また以外のゲーム。今はありえない。
However, in an interview with Satoru Iwata, Itoi said that the reason why he doesn't want to make a new Mother game is because he wants to be the player. He also stated in the same interview that he wouldn't mind if someone else made it. This could mean he is willing to pass the torch on to someone else. So, if someone at Nintendo steps up, there could still be a chance of a new game. Even though other countries don't have these games besides EarthBound, Nintendo has still shown audiences outside of Japan that they at least acknowledge the franchise's existence. Ness has been a recurring playable character in Super Smash Bros. Ever since the first game.
Okay.
Lucas from Mother 3 was brought in as a playable character in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. This shows that they haven't ignored their audiences and are not keeping it under wraps. If you like RPGs, then these games are definitely worth a shot. If it's true that Americans' interests for RPGs were indifferent in 1995, that it's long since changed. This has been proven with the releases of RPGs like Final Fantasy and Pokemon. In fact, one of EarthBound's development companies, Ape, changed their names to Creatures Incorporated and co-developed the Pokemon franchise. If marketing was another problem, I think Nintendo can still re-release the games knowing what they know now. They could still promote the games in a more well-thought-out and informative manner if they wanted to. Some might think that Nintendo won't localize the games overseas, even if fans are constantly demanding them to. I don't believe this is true because they have indeed localized other games to countries that were requesting them. For example, a fan campaign called Operation Rainfall was made to make 3 Wii games available in the US. These games included Xenoblade Chronicles, The Last Story, and Pandora's Tower. All 3 games have been released here in the US and received positive reviews. This could mean the same can be done for the Mother franchise as well. Plus, Shigesato Itoi just recently announced on Twitter that he's planning to republish the series. With this and EarthBound's Virtual Console release confirmed, it does show a sign of hope for the rest of the games. There are many ways video games draw in the player. Some of these ways include gameplay, story, and overall design. The Mother franchise does all 3 of these things. It includes gameplay elements that are unlike any other video game. The stories are deep and well written. They include their funny moments, their dark moments, as well as their sad moments. The settings in the games range from fun and goofy to dark and nerve-setting. These features are what draw the players to the games. Because of this, the number of fans has grown steadily over the years. There's even an unofficial Mother 4 fan game in the works. This shows how much fans outside of Japan are devoted to this series. Whatever happens though, one thing is for sure. As long as there's a fan base, as long as people care, this is far from over.